Hello, and welcome to Transformations Cafe, where we're serving light as bold as love. I'm your host, Ken Marks, and Transformations Cafe is brought to you by the Institute for Global Transformation. We're a nonprofit, all volunteer organization with a vision for a world working together to utilize the power, love, and wisdom of higher consciousness to benefit humanity and the planet. And our mission is to support transformations in consciousness and in the way humanity interacts with one another so as to bring about positive change in the world individually and collectively. We would love for you to join our community, at least start by checking us out on our website. Its address is theglobaltransformation.org. If you would like to formally become part of the new community, or at least get on our newsletter, there's a join button at the top of each webpage, and we've got membership options, as well as you can just sign up for the newsletter. If you would like to support us in the work we're doing, including programs like this one, there's also a donate button on each page. This program is being recorded and will be published on IFGT's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the channel if you would, please. And then if you select the bell icon, you can choose your notification preferences so that whenever there's new content posted, you'll be notified. Transformation Cafe is recorded in front of a live audience. So with that, it is, again, an absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest, Ann Mathie. Ann is a delightful human being and a wealth of knowledge that she synthesizes in ways that are as approachable for everyone as they can be, since a lot of the subject matter we deal with is unusual. If you're not used to it, it takes some learning and getting used to it. And it's a beautiful job of putting this in terms that are approachable for anyone, but especially those who are either very interested in the topic or have had experiences that her work addresses so beautifully. So I'm going to read a brief bio. We're going to spend the rest of our time with Ann talking about Kundalini energy in particular. Her knowledge base, it goes way beyond this, but she's very gifted in this area, and it's an area we haven't really touched on yet much in this format on this program. And I wanted to make sure we get this in our library as well, so that anyone accessing the video can be helped by it. So with that, Ann's lived experiences, teaching and research have provided her with a rich knowledge and understanding of Kundalini energy. She's been practicing yoga and meditation for the past 20 years, exploring practices in the Tantric, Yogic, and Buddhist field. With a master's in the traditions of yoga and meditation from SOAS University, Ann gives regular talks on the knowledge produced by the insights from meditation masters throughout history and our current exploration in cutting-edge consciousness theory. Her research focuses on the phenomenology of Buddhist and yogic experiences through practice. Ann's years of practice in teaching yoga and meditation allow her to integrate scholarly research with the real lived experience of meditation and yoga, including Kundalini awakening. So with that, a very heartfelt welcome to you, Ann. It's a delight to have you here, and thank you again for accepting our invitation and being with us today.
Thanks for having me. No, I'm delighted to be here and chat to you about this subject. It's my favorite subject.
Yeah, I had, as I mentioned to Ann, an email post before today, and then as we were gearing up to go live, I watched a number of her videos, and at the outset, I want to also say that this program is not intended at all to try to build an audience for growth's sake. We're not trying to be the one go-to source. What I really want to do is be part of what came to me in a meditation, the million threads of a tapestry being woven together. And there are more and more groups, and there are more individuals that are awakening and being drawn to various aspects of consciousness and spirituality. We are one such group. I'm one such person. Please, if you watch this and want more, do a search on Ann Mathie. Last name is spelled Mathie. First name is Ann. Search for her on YouTube. She's got some outstanding interviews, including Buddha at the Gas Pump and a two-part interview with the Kundalini Collective, as well as some recordings of some great presentations that she's given that really go into some very cool aspects of history and some of the science behind this. Is really, so there's a wealth of other information. So please know that that's there. And it's just a very generous person with her time as well. So I don't want to offer up phone numbers or emails unless you want to, but we'll at least steer people to your website. I believe it's annmathie.com. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm always happy for an email as well, and to discuss things either via Zoom or an email chat. Yeah.
Okay. I thought to get the conversation rolling, since even though it's this word Kundalini has worked its way somewhat into the zeitgeist, it's still something that is not necessarily a household word, much less what it is. So if you would maybe start us off with just kind of your description of it, and an overview at least of some of its historical origins. It's your
sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a big subject. It's an Indian word, and it comes from traditions of meditation and yoga. It means it's synonymous with so many things, but in the human experience, it's often referred to as a primordial energy that seems to erupt within the physiology and within the consciousness of individuals. A commonplace experience with Kundalini is an emergence into an experience that transcends the self. What I mean by that is you start to, or the experience breaks down the walls of one's ego, of one's I-ness, and one starts to experience existence beyond the walls of the self. So this is like an emerging into everything else around. I mean, this is a very classic phenomena that arises with Kundalini, but essentially within the Indian traditions, what it refers to is a primordial energy that awakens, animates, and enlivens all of consciousness and all of matter in the entire universe. So it moves through us. It moves through everything. It's a life force. When we all have it functioning all the time. We need it in order to function and to be alive and to be conscious. However, sometimes there's an explosion of this energy where people start to have some pretty far out experiences. It changes the psychology for sure. It's a kind of intelligence. The yogis of India would worship it as a deity or a goddess. It takes on many forms, and it's something which I would describe, it's definitely an intelligence. It's got its own, how would you say, agenda. That can be something that people might experience with it. It seems to manifest in so many different ways, depending on the individual's experience, makeup, psychology. So it can't really be defined as one thing. When we're dealing with the mind, we're dealing with lots of different caveats, lots of different things. But yeah, that would be a summary, I suppose.
And if you could, because I think one of the things that, and we'll probably get into this a little more as the conversation unfolds, but I think there's can be a lot of skepticism and doubt, as well as even outright confusion with mental health disturbances. Yeah. And one of the things that can be very helpful, certainly was personally to me, was understanding that this has got a very rich context in human history.
Oh, yeah.
If you can just touch on that a little bit in terms of where and when these phenomena were kind of first, at least, identified, so that we have a record of them? How long ago are we talking about? How long has this been known?
Ooh. Well, in the Indian traditions, it goes back as far as the Vedas. They would and this is about 1500 BC. So this is in the Indian continent, and there's poems dedicated to the wandering Muni, intoxicated on bliss, not intoxicated as in drugs or wine, but intoxicated on the bliss for God, a human ecstasy, a natural ecstasy. We go back even further to the Kalahari Bushmen, and they have a experience called Num and Kya. So this is a state that about half of the population would manage to get themselves into through trance or dancing, and it would be again a heat that rises from the belly, and as it rises, it expands the consciousness. The mind opens up. The mind has insight into what's beyond the flesh, a liminal state, and this is aroused through trance, through drumming, through dancing. This is also an experience that happens within ancient Egypt. So Kemet is what it was once called, and this is documented. They have a kind of practice that's similar to yoga with breathing exercises, where they would learn to manipulate this energy. So it's in terms of direct referencing to this energy, definitely Kemet would be one place. Num in the Kalahari Bushmen, that's certainly another place. It's insinuated in many other cultures, yet it's not necessarily directly referred to as a kind of primordial energy in the same way that the Indian technologies would refer to it. But so yeah, I mean, Greek, of course, they have it. The Caduceus is a reference to that. They even have terms synonymous with Bindu, or elixir of life, or ecstatic or inducing fluids within the human physiology. So it's definitely in our psyche from many different cultures. In shamanic traditions, again, it's not necessarily directly referred to, but it's certainly there are states that are mentioned and discussed. Different cultures will have a different way of holding it, interpreting it, working with it. So yeah, it really does depend on where you're looking from, but it's definitely it's in our DNA, it's in our history, it's in our psychology, it's in our frameworks.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. That's a nice reference to help go toward your mission, which I also didn't want to get through this interview without noting that you talked about this in one or two of the prior interviews I watched preparing for this. And your mission's beautiful, just to bring this to as many people as possible and normalize it so that it's accessible. And there's so much of this that as our paths unfold, I think it becomes clear that everything is from one source, and therefore the information that we come to begins to integrate more because it is all related. And so we had a wonderful woman named Betty Kovach as a guest a couple of months ago, and she talked about the was it the non-Bush people?
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
And so just a relationship with that, and then also we've interviewed Dr. Yvonne Kaysen a couple of times, who has a beautiful description of some of the Indian and Buddhist relationships to Kundalini energy and its relationship to other spiritually transformative experiences. So it does all go together. It's very cool. Chris Chavez has already made reference to his interest in asking questions. So go ahead, Chris, please.
Thanks, Ann, for that description. You mentioned in your description the idea or the event of human fluids. It's my understanding that the term sex means spinal excretion of some kind. When you refer to human fluids, are you making reference to the sexual orgasm relating to Kundalini?
I get that would be a manifestation of it. A manifestation of Kundalini is so it's a complex system of subtle body energies. A manifestation of it is the birth of humans, the creation of humans, the propagation of human life. In a channeled, refined yogic body, or someone who would maybe practice towards higher consciousness, meaning a consciousness that is not drawn towards physicality, desire, attraction, then those same fluids are transmuted through the body chemically, alchemically, if you like, in order to produce a different kind of experience through the system. An ecstasy, yet it's not just in the genitals, which would make a baby or just for fun, but something that would produce an experience which is transpersonal, transcendental. So in the yogic systems, they're working with this, with these fluids. I mean, this in one of the many, many systems that there are. So like nut yogis or the hatha yoga system, they would use that fluid, transmute that fluid. They would live a life of abstinence to use that fluid as a way to access samadhi, higher states of consciousness, and it would be retained in the cranial vault. And that's where, through purification practices, you would access that, and then that would move through the system in an ecstatic way. So it would be an ecstasy, a sublime kind of ecstasy, more intense than an orgasm. The Buddhist sexual tantric systems would use the orgasm. However, you would need to be trained in concentration methods so that you didn't fall into desire. If the mind would fall into desire, then you lose it. You lose your seed. The idea is to use passion, desire as an ignition to access a higher state again. So this is all about learning to train the mind so that it doesn't get, I mean, okay, so I'm only speaking in behalf of certain yogic, tantric and Buddhist traditions. There are so many out there that work with this. I know the Chinese systems do use the sexual orgasm as a means to longevity, physical longevity. That's not an area that I'm expert in at all. I've read a few books on it, but I'm not, I certainly wouldn't be able to talk on that in detail. However, it is definitely there are many complex systems which a tantrika or a yogi would use in different ways, use those fluids in different ways. And there's a lot of different texts that talk about the various uses of these fluids. But I think what is common amongst these texts is that it's not the methodology is meant for a spiritual attainment. There's a lot more on this subject.
Absolutely. and I just would add that because, again, everything is integrated and related, there are elements of all of this that are going to have a sexual energy component that, so on the one hand, and I think I'll use this as a segue to maybe get into a little bit more of a description from Ann about, so how does this manifest? But there can be physical manifestations that are sexual as part of this energy. But Yvonne Kaysen has identified that there's a different but related energy that I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. I think it's Ojas. It's OJAS.
Ojas, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be it.
Yeah, and so it's different than Kundalini, but there is a relationship. And I think one of the things that is helpful in our entire kind of spiritual awakening and transformations is learning discernment. And one, in this context, discerning whether this is actually Kundalini energy that may be being experienced versus the ojas or something that kind of sort of looks like it. So
it's a really good question. And I think this is something that does come up a lot. When you say, in the West, when we hear the word tantra, we automatically assume it's around sexual practices. The main bulk of the traditions are not about sexual practices. There are a handful of traditions. I mean, you've got to remember here, when we're looking at the Indian traditions, there's just so many lineages, so many practices. We're working with a subtle body framework, which is used in so many different ways. So it would be wrong to say this is how it is.
Yeah.
It depends what tradition you're looking at. I recently met a lovely lady who did her PhD research. She did ethnographic research at tantric temples in India. And this particular tantric temple that she was working at was sexual practice tantra. And they are very rare. They're not exposed. They're quite under the radar. They're very secret. And it would be, so the kind of main philosophy was this primordial energy is everywhere. This there's an innocence around it. However, there isn't, in the same way that it's an energy that propagates life. It's a beautiful, innocent kind of reflection upon it. So that is certainly a thing, and there would be a whole structure and practice around addressing, relating, and using this energy. So it's certainly, it's a vast topic, but at the end of the day, it's the manifestation of all vitality and life force. So yes, I suppose you would have to include that within that. That's
yeah. And it was interesting, in one of your conversations I was listening to, there was a reference to glamour, which is certainly familiar to those of us studying the wisdom. And in the West, as you said, with a reference to the term tantric, but also just in general. But in this context, one of the things that Kundalini energy would do would be to reorient and help to kind of dissolve that conditioned orientation to sex and sexual activity, and show it as part of the beauty of everything, and actually how sacred it is in its own right. So why don't we use this then, again, as an opportunity to ask you for some of the kind of, again, broad brushstroke ways that awakenings occur, as well as what some of the more common symptoms or experiences or manifestations are.
Okay, yeah.
Kundalini
So
awakening.
there's a whole, I suppose there's okay, if we were to categorize, just for the sake of making it digestible, there would be spontaneous arousals that arise out of nowhere, seemingly. However, there are conditions which provoke it to happen. And there's the structured path. So this would be people who train in certain practices, and that would ignite or initiate an opening or an awakening. So this would be the Buddhist practices, tantric practices, yogic practices, and I'm sure many, many, many more around the world, which I am unfamiliar with, but they exist. So in regards to the spontaneous practices, spontaneous awakenings, this what it could look like psychologically is someone would just be going about their way. They may have a sudden experience of ecstasy from nowhere. They may feel electricity moving through their bodies. They may start to become extremely sensitive to emotion, sound, sight, color. They may start to have dreams that appear extremely lucid. It's like a kind of turning up the dial on sensitivity. Sometimes people experience a lot of psychic phenomena. Most of the time, and if not all of the time, it has a spiritual nature to it. And by spiritual, I mean pertaining to a awareness of greater connectivity, an awareness of something more than just us here, something transcendental, something beyond the human mind or individual ego. So these, I suppose spiritual could be seen as quite a woo-woo word, can't it? And that's where people get turned off in some realms. But it's actually, I suppose now in psychology, they would refer to these things as liminal states or a noosphere or a transpersonal state. But these are certainly, these spontaneous experiences allow the individual to access altered states of consciousness or enter into a collective consciousness or access a wider part of their being. Now, you said earlier that it does try to work its way up to allow the individual to experience a more kind of divine, if you like, experience. That, I would say, that would be the human being that does that. The energy itself has no discernment over light or dark. It's everything. It's all encompassing. It's manifestation of all quarters of our universe and all manifestations of mind. It is mind. It is everything that we perceive, the matrix, if you like. And the human being, the human psychology will naturally start to untangle its knots and its psychological processes, its egoic identities. So often as well in the spontaneous experiences, these subconscious patterns of behavior will arise to the surface, sometimes quite quickly, sometimes all at once, which can be really overwhelming for the individual. So it can look like a breakdown. It can look like a psychosis. It can look like bipolar. The person might have tremendous energy and inspiration. It can look like schizophrenia because the person is hallucinating, having visions, having ecstatic sensations and experiences. So, however, they're quite different. There's no, I mean, maybe there is a change in the brain on a very subtle level, but there's no damage to it. There's no, how would you say? There's no major physiological transformation other than a psychological purification. That's often how it's referred to. In a structured path. So I'll talk about, from what I know in the Buddhist traditions, you would start by preparing, because of our neuroplasticity, because of our ability to shape our minds. You would prepare the mind first. We would make the mind have a healthy ego, a healthy way of looking at the self in and amongst society, relating to our friends and our family, which meant we would resolve our own psychological issues through therapy, through certain meditation practices, and prepare for concentration, samadhi, where you learn to concentrate and focus the mind, and you can activate it as well through yoga techniques. But yeah, so that would be a general kind of overview of those two paths, or those two ways that it can manifest. Some of the more bizarre experiences that can happen, or phenomena that can arise. Should I go on to talk about?
Please, although I did want to say one thing, because you've also, in answering this question in prior occasions, talked about it as a process.
Right.
So that there is, while there is this intertwining and dance that the human mind and ego will do with this energy, and it's a huge component of the phenomenon. I think the idea of it being a process that does have, well, you mentioned before, there is an intelligence to this, and the process and the intelligence, at least to me, convey a sense of purpose, that there is a reason this is happening when we experience this. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely feels like that. And I think we can look at this experience from a lot of different levels. From the human level, there appears to be a process that happens in that there is a purification of your own psychology, purification of your own spirit, purification of your own positioning in the world. One becomes a lot more altruistic if we are to process this in a wholesome way. And again, this can go a bit haywire if it's not necessarily something that always works its way out in a wholesome, altruistic way. This is down to the work of the individual as well. You can get cases of delusions of grandeur, where the human identity will start to go, wow, I'm Jesus, or I'm God, or I'm, amazing and special. And that's where you can get a lot of the unhelpful psychological processes with this thing, with this Kundalini energy. That's why the traditions always talk about preparing the ego, humility, a lot of prostration, a lot of loving kindness, a lot of diminishing the ego so that you can just allow it to do its thing without getting in the way too much. And by that, I mean, it's like, okay, an upgrade, and I'm saying this from a human perspective, in that the nervous system becomes a lot more sensitive.
Right.
Now, that can be a bad thing if you're in a rough environment, but through that sensitivity, you start to experience and see the subtle nuances of communication, relationships, energies. And through that, one has the potential to develop mastery, as well as identifying areas in society that could be improved, as well as looking into areas of science or technology in much more detail and refined concentration. So those are the potential outcomes, and that's dependent on the individual's passion and drives. Again, as a result of this transpersonal sensitivity, people start to work towards something greater than themselves, greater than their own altruistic, egoic drive of success, money, me. And that happens as a result of this new awareness, new sensitivity. It's too painful to do that. It's too painful. There's alarm bells go off when one starts to behave in selfish ways. So, and again, this is the human interpretation. This is the human. It does depend on how the person navigates this experience individually.
And the environment they're in, and when you don't have the benefit of in a controlled environment with gifted and educated teachers and guides to help you prepare, etc. And speaking from personal experience, when these things just start happening, it can be very off-putting. And I have no qualms in sharing my own experience, because I feel that's now part of my service and that altruism. And so my first glances with this were so frightening that I shut it down immediately. And it wasn't until years later that I began just a kind of very initial meditation practice, and I was experiencing physical kriyas, and they spontaneously reemerged almost immediately. I had totally forgotten that I had the experience years ago. And one of the most critical things that came to me, and I now think it's part of that intelligence of this energy, was to not give in to the fear again. And now, as I've learned so much more, that was the beginning of surrendering to it and allowing it to be there and to work with it. And I think that's really important. I do want to hear what you have to say about common elements and characteristics. We do have another question. Does psychological cleansing produce spiritual empathy about others or other ideas?
It can do, yes. And I think there's quite a diverse range of experiences that people have from Kundalini, and it's quite interesting in interviews and meeting people who've had very different experiences of Kundalini. There are people I've met who pertain towards Buddhism, the concept of the Bodhisattva, and I think this depends on, and I have no evidence of this, and I would love to do more research into it, depending on the nature of the awakening. There are different kinds of awakening that can happen, and different people will have a different area of their psychology enhanced, maybe, and that can be the heart and compassion, and those people may be drawn towards bodhisattva type things. Some of the experiences which can be challenging in that would be compassion. And I mean challenging because you start to experience people's pain. You feel their pain, and that can extend to animals, to people all over the world, and the heartache that you feel with that. It creates a sort of a love and a compassion and a wish for their pain to stop. I think this is a really beautiful and difficult thing to overcome. So through the practices and the techniques, people would keep developing their sensitivity, but then keep learning how to humble oneself and cultivate more loving kindness, to learn to cope, learn to deal with that level of sensitivity. Other areas that may open, so people might have a kind of a sexual awakening, and they will develop tremendous vitality, tremendous charisma as well, and that kind of I suppose power, if you like, can direct and allure and start things up. So there's different personalities in terms of how this manifests, and these people would be kind of, I suppose, drawn towards different things in life. But yeah, there's certainly different ways that it would manifest. And I don't know if I answered that question. There was more to it. You were
just wondering if it produced spiritual empathy about others and other ideas, and I think the short answer, which you did answer, is yes, and because it's all encompassing. It
right.
writes your entire perceptions and conditioning and even subconscious thinking about life in the world and yourself and other people and other beings, etc. And so it almost by definition would have to include how you view people spiritually and do develop a compassion for others as well as oneself.
Yeah. Well, as well, though, that that's not necessarily how it would naturally, it can manifest that way, but some people might look towards self-enlightenment, and that's it. Some people might choose to go into a mountain, never see another human being ever again, and just meditate until they become enlightened, and not feel an urge to serve. And so that I think that really depends on your influences, the nature of the individual. It is, that sense of service that arises, or a calling. That's really common with these things. It does arise, and maybe, I suppose, the risk of getting too esoteric. There's a well, in the Indian traditions, karma and rebirth is just a given, and whatever part of your journey you are on, you might just need to refine and enhance certain aspects, and that's where you are on your extended journey. The whole birth and life thing is part of a continuum, and we focus on particular areas in different lives, right, particular areas of our development. But then we're entering into a really esoteric realm. But these are experiences that people have. I've recently been interviewing and looking at meditative experiences of looking into past lives, through certain meditation techniques. And that's certainly something that people commonly express as seemingly evident.
So, yeah, like I said, we could talk for days because this is such a rich, all-encompassing topic that integrates with everything, because that's part of what this does or can do. But again, if there were somebody that especially was not familiar with this, and they might be here today, or they might be bumping into this later as they're gathering their own information, and they're wondering, is this what's happening to me? What would be some of the telltales, if you will, that might help them say, oh, I wonder, yeah, this might be what's happening to me?
Okay, in terms of symptoms, or
yeah.
Okay, so there's quite a lot. They can manifest in different ways. You might feel electricity moving through the system, intense shaking in every limb, so like a clenching and a shaking. The spontaneous kriyas, that's a common. People start doing mudras or jerky head movements, or limbs flying all over the place, waking up in yoga postures in the middle of the night. Involuntary movements like with the eyeballs or facial muscles or limbs, that seems to be a common one as well. That would in yoga they refer to those as yoga kriyas, a way of getting things out, the physiology, an exorcism of whatever through the through the body. There are bliss or ecstatic type experiences. I mean, the classic Kundalini experience is heat or fire moving up the spine, or electricity moving up the spine. The central column is a big thing, and that would be a drawing all of the energy in to the central column, and that's where you get the higher states of consciousness. That's where one would experience the higher states of consciousness. People have out-of-body experiences. People have telepathic experiences, and that sounds like someone is quite, I suppose, far out in that you maybe hear voices, see dead people. It's the whole range of psychic phenomena can happen. God, there's loads. Again, the emotions arising to the surface. The process of purification initially is quite intense. Dark night of the soul as well. That can be a heavy one, but quite common. A sense of like wanting to be with God or Jesus, or a yearning, a devotion, a strong devotion for to be with one, a greater spirit, whatever culture or language you want to call it. There's people can feel like they're in an eternal now. The body becomes unrecognizable. The personality starts to fall away. Things like your own senses start to change. Your hearing, your sight starts to change. Sometimes I've spoken to people who develop certain abilities. They call them siddhis, where you can see through the skin, see the bones, see the muscles, see human anatomy. Quite far out. And in our culture, unexplainable. Whereas in Indian traditions, they talk about these things quite a lot. There's a lot of traditions which allow these. And again, this is a part of the whole normalization. I believe that these things are just a part of human evolution. Yeah. If we think about what we have the potential for in terms of what our nervous system is capable of, there's so much more. What gets in the way of these ultra sensitive states that we can refine and use is our own identification thing. the grasping of our personality, the thoughts that go on all day long, the nonsense that goes on in our heads, the thinking from one subject to the other. Yeah.
The attachment to
The
our,
attack. Yeah.
yeah. The it is. It has been described also as it is an energetic phenomenon, and everything really is energy. And so these manifestations, as you're describing, can be physical, they can be psychological, they can be emotional.
Yeah.
And it's all energy, and it's all energy moving through as part of this process. And part of that acceptance and surrendering is it can be helpful to develop that discerning awareness and understand that the reason you're suddenly feeling an emotion that seems to come from nowhere, or thought, just have no explanation as to where they may have popped in from, can be also part of this larger process and phenomena. And so it can be extraordinarily difficult and wonderful. And so many times I think about this parable of the old Chinese farmer with the one horse and the one son. And I don't want to go into the whole thing, but the idea is that there are these turns of events that initially, when they happen, look either very good or disastrous. And as life keeps rolling out, the circumstances change, and what initially looked bad can turn out to be great fortune, and vice versa.
So true. Yeah.
It can be true with this phenomena that at times you may be left just like, if you do, for instance, have a dark night period, and you might be just distraught and wondering, what the heck is going on. Mm-hmm. Then later, how that fit in with your unfolding and your spiritual growth and transformation becomes clearer. And so developing that trust, that's part of the surrender, I think, to be able to observe it and trust that it's part of a process. And that can be extremely challenging, all the more if you have no frame of reference for what might be going on. So again, I hope at least one person hears this and they say, thanks, this is really helpful, and it may go there. So
yeah, you're so right with the trust. That's a massive thing. That's such a I think a beautiful way to not hinder the process. I think that as soon as we try and get involved and change it and manipulate it, then you can meet resistance with it. But like, you were saying with the trust, that's such a beauty. In the Indian tradition, they call that Shraddha. And that's like a power in and of itself, that faith, not blind faith. It's like surrender, like you say. It's a beautiful thing. And by doing that, you're opening the heart. And that act alone will allow this energy to move to a higher center. When I say higher center, I mean something of more compassion, of more, how like when you let a child be itself, it can grow in beautiful ways. When you give space around someone, they're allowed to express themselves in incredible dimensions and beauty. I would see it as the same thing, like a kind of mother, like a mother. It can be a mother-like energy. Well, I suppose it can manifest in many ways, but we can call that in through faith and trust and surrender.
Yeah, it takes a lot. It takes a lot then to not slip into, again, that glamour, those egoic manifestations of somehow I'm now special because I'm having this experience. So, it's like learning to ride a bike, and get to the point where you don't have to think about staying balanced, but you still have to do the things that maintain that balance. What would you say then would be just some things that would be helpful to be deliberate or conscious about of things to do regarding Kundalini energy, especially if you're interested in it and experiencing it and trying to learn more, as well as what would be good counsel to not do.
Ooh. Well, I don't want to go into right or wrong with this, because I think everyone has their own path and everyone has the different faculties as well. Like what might be okay for someone because they've got the faculties to deal with it a certain way. By faculties, I mean they might be of a certain character type. They might be of a certain robustness that can cope with a certain way of being, and someone more sensitive might struggle. So what I found, so for me, my experience happened and I let go to it and I ran with it and I embraced it and I let it completely take over. Sometimes when I reflect, I'm not sure if that was extremely helpful. There are times where maybe I could have brought in a bit of self-discipline. I could have brought in some work earlier on. It was only till I got a bit older that I started to work on myself and my problems and my issues and my pain and all the things that humans suffer from. I think we all have our issues. This is normal. This is a part of being human. So for me, I think looking at people who have had big Kundalini awakenings, and 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, just seeing how that's kind of changed and manifested, I think it's extremely wise to develop the capacity for equanimity. Yeah. And what I mean by that is the ability to withdraw oneself from a situation and observe what's happening with equanimity, like not getting emotionally involved and worked up in the drama or the situation or having to get involved and fix and change things. I think one of the, if you can train the mind to not get attached to what's going on and just step back and breathe and observe, then that's a really great way to allow the crazy stuff that sometimes arises in your life just to arise and pass, rather than following that rabbit hole down some difficult or awkward scene that we never really had to run down. As well as that, loving kindness, developing a loving heart. That's really, really, really crucial, I think, if we want a positive or a wholesome outcome with this. So, I mean, okay, so in a spiritual context, of course, to develop love is a no-brainer. In a psychological context, you're reducing the fight or flight response to life, which is physiologically so unhealthy. We get drained and burnt out by constantly in that fight or flight. Those two combined, loving kindness and equanimity, you're onto a really, really good path, I think. If you can apply those things, train the mind to apply those qualities to life situations. We don't want to become a robot and like disengage. This is the thing. I think the difference between non-attachment and detached.
Yes.
Detached is like you're shutting down. It's kind of like a freeze response to a situation. Non-attachment means you're allowing your body to feel what's happening and arise to the surface within you. You're in it. You're experiencing these complexes arise through the body. You feel that heartache, that discomfort in your tummy, that stress in your system, but you're not reacting.
You're aware.
You're totally aware. Yeah.
You're aware without being hijacked and
exactly.
And that is something that can be thought of, I think, is like just the same way you would develop a creative talent. It's something that can constantly be refined and actually come to also appreciate that as part of the deliciousness of life. It's just understanding.
Good word. Yeah.
None of this that we're talking about, except I think in rare occasions. But rarely is this something that you get this flash, you're changed forever and you're done.
No, that's right. It takes years.
Dr. said, there is no there. It's it's a process that continually builds and unfolds, and learning to embrace that equanimity and the compassion is at least as important and effective, I guess, when it's turned inward and you develop the true unconditional self. That's so hard to do, and I heard you talking about this elsewhere, and it's a common topic of just how pervasive so many people struggle with self-worth.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
have this phenomenon visit you, it can shine a light on that too, and you have to unpack where is that coming from, and to truly learn what unconditional self-love is, which then just flows out to the rest of everything. But it's awfully hard to be that loving, I think, if you're still holding on to something that isn't equal or greater than to yourself.
No, it's very true. It's very true.
The when I think about suggestions of what not to do,
Mm.
I think about that it's not uncommon that if you mention Kundalini, some people might respond kind of with they get out the garlic and the cross,
Oh,
because they've heard that it can be scary, bad, etc. And on
yeah.
the flip side, there are increasing presentations in the mainstream to try to stimulate synthetically, if you will, an awakening. Because I think there's a connection to, wow, all my problems will be solved. I have eternal bliss if I can just
Mm.
get that Kundalini thing I heard about going. And I think the two are related, because if you don't allow this to occur naturally or spontaneously, or do it with the guidance in a controlled environment that would be healthy,
Mm.
you may get more than you bargained for.
Mm.
And the effects can be really significant, either personally, emotionally, psychologically, but they can also be extremely disruptive or destructive to your life. I know of marriages that have ended and careers that have shifted. People have moved to different continents. Their
Mm.
lives can be undone, and that can be okay if it's the natural unfolding, but it can be extremely traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think that people need to have a caution about is, if you have experienced significant trauma in your life, this process can also bring that up again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
that's for
cause
sure.
it to be um, brought into the light, out of the shadows, and dealt with.
Mm.
Usually not very pleasant. If you're not ready,
Mm.
that can also be something that could be um, in trouble. So I would suggest that people do consider seeking professional guidance. There are wonderful transpersonal psychologists that are very well adapted at understanding these processes, and make use of those helpers in the world. Anything else on that you can add?
Yeah, no, you've summed that up beautifully. Indeed. And I think what we have to consider with regards to Kundalini and the maybe Christian response to it, or the Western response, is that when the British went to India a long time ago in the 1800s, we brought back Eastern mysticism, but we kind of we muddied that with Western. So I'm talking about Victorian British England, when they went to India and they discovered all of these mystical, exotic, yogic phenomena and tantra, and they took it out of context. So there was a lot of context that was missing. And when that was brought back to the UK and shared, it was kind of how do you say, presented as if it was a circus, or taken out of context. There was no real understanding of the beauty of Kundalini. And that's how this sort of negative persona of the experience was kind of spiraled, I guess you could say, in the West. And that's how that knowledge began to seep into areas where people thought it was dark or scary or unhelpful or not good, and mixed in, or similarities were drawn with old pagan cultures, which, in terms of Christian development, those older cultures within the Western within Western history were kind of suppressed in a way, changed, transformed, transmutated. However, we do find a lot of this stuff in Christianity. When you listen to certain hymns of Jesus talking about certain meditative practices, he talks about this energy. Obviously, he doesn't use these words, but he refers to similar sentiments that the Indians were talking about. So it's definitely there. They don't go into detail. However, there are a lot of Christian mystics that go into that experience in a lot more detail. So I think there's a number of things going on in our in the Western psychology with Kundalini, which can cause a sort of fear of it, which, when we talk about surrendering or letting go to this energy, there are times where, because we have to get up and go to work and behave in a civilized manner, we have to suppress certain urges that maybe Kundalini would move through you. You know, you'd be on the train or in a bus stop or in a restaurant and you feel the urge to have a kriya, you would contain that because you don't want to look crazy. So that kind of suppression of that energy can cause the psychology to get a bit mangled up in the process. If we allow ourselves to take ourselves somewhere natural and free and secluded, where you allow this energy just to work its way through you, you know, in a sort of safe environment where you won't be mocked or ridiculed or judged, you know, that's often, I think, a really good idea. We don't want to hinder or keep it down. In terms of what not to do, I don't. You know, there are lots of people say don't do Kundalini yoga, don't do all of those things if the energy is working its way through. I would say that's a very case by case scenario. I know people who have had it, went full on into the yoga and the Kundalini yoga, and it was great and they loved it and they were up for the journey and they were up for the ride, good and bad, and they went with it. And I know people who did that and it brought up too many difficult things. So
did the people that did try to stimulate this energy, but did they go into it with at least some knowing of what to expect, or that the intention was consistent with what they might experience?
I think somehow there's an intuition involved.
Okay.
So, I mean, again, this is case by case, but lots of people talk about a knowing that arises, and this depends on the level of insight that happens. There's degrees of awakening. You see, there could be mild experiences where there isn't much insight into what's going on, or there could be explosions, and through that awakening, there is insight which arises into an understanding of the nature of the universe and the mind. So there's the direct experience of how the mind works, or the nature of this reality, how it unfolds. And as a result of that, there's a intuition or a knowledge which arises at the same time. When it's not so strong, then we're kind of left like wondering, oh, what was that? What do I do? You know, it wasn't so potent to launch you into direct experience of those other layers of our psyche to the extent that you can see what's going on. So, I mean, it can happen that some people have full-blown awakenings and that's it. They live in a non-dual state and they're done. That's
that's
few, very few, and it's rare.
Right. And I think again, the caution I feel is our instant gratification, short attention span. These aren't things to fear. They're not to be trifled with. They're to be respected and treated as something beautiful but sacred.
Yeah, I agree. It is beautiful and it is sacred. Yes, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. We're talking about destruction of the ego here,
Yeah.
and there's certain meditation experiences or Kundalini experiences which involve different degrees of that destruction of the ego, and that can happen in a pleasant dissolving way, or that can happen in a crumbling down kind of way. Either way, how we pick up the pieces or how we assimilate or how we make sense of that experience is how we move forward. I've had and spoke to people who've had experience in meditation where it's complete dissolution of everything, complete dissolving of everything all at once. And that's terrifying because you feel like annihilation, not just death, but the end of everything. And these are the experiences that can arise when someone is prepared and has walked a traditional path where there's a gradual breaking down of this ego or refining of the ego. Then there is a more gracious stepping into that no mind state that the Zen Buddhists talk about, or the non-dual tantrics talk about. I do feel, though, that at the end of the day, we are human beings, and we have our families, and we have our friends, and we have our jobs, and we have our circumstances and our karma. I think it's really important to work through that in the best way we can without producing more negative situations in our lives. I've certainly heard of people who have been through intense Kundalini experiences and have neglected those things and later come to regret that. So there's always, in the traditions, in the yogic and the tantric and the Buddhist, the foundations to this path are very moral. By moral, I don't mean you're going to hell if you do this. I mean, you act out of kindness. You take away any intention to harm others. If there is an ounce of that intention, you have to work to reverse that or refine that. Or you think a negative thought towards someone, you reverse that by immediately sending them a thought of loving kindness. Or if you think of a selfish action upon someone where you want to take something from them, you immediately do the reverse. And that's the kind of way of, neuroplasticity, rewiring certain patterns of behavior which might work a certain way. And that's how we can be sure that a more wholesome outcome of Kundalini will arise, will manifest. I think that's so, so important. It's such a gift. Like you say, it's a blessing. It's an absolute blessing. And I think it is partly the responsibility of the individual to cultivate the right kind of intentions, the right attitudes. I mean, by right attitudes, I mean wholesome, good, loving, caring, those sorts of things.
And
it's boring, isn't it? But it's
but it is, all of this is just, it's just got this kind of richness, deliciousness of being able to craft this, because this is not then mean you go all the way to one end of the spectrum and become a doormat and suffer
right.
sorts of harm and indignity. You are developing a way of blending with your higher self and seeing that in everyone. It's namaste, right? And so it's that, but it does not translate that you're going to have peace, love, and understanding with every personality you encounter in your life. You just see it in a broader perspective, but it takes time, and it takes time to then, when you do have those feelings of reflexive kind of what a jerk kind of attitude, you don't immediately then turn yourself, oh no, I'm not being spiritual enough, and beat yourself.
Right. Yeah. The
at once. So
exactly. Yes. So we don't want to there's no need to give ourselves a hard time. We're all human.
right.
And this is, I think that's the thing, isn't it? We can do our best. That's all we can do at the end of the
No,
day to work through.
I want to thank you for extending the time here, and I don't want to abuse it. And so probably looking at another 10 to 15 minutes. I just want to briefly mention it, and then if you have other resources that you would suggest, as we've mentioned earlier in the conversation, there are a lot of resources available. A few that I know of that I think are helpful. You can go to kundaliniguide.com. They have all sorts of things there. There's one article, 10 things you can do to help your Kundalini process that might be especially helpful. There are many organizations, but one, the Kundalini Collective, which is at kundalinicollective.org. They are a community that can be there to help answer questions, and participating, going through an awakening process in community can also be extremely helpful. So there are lots of them, but this is one that I think I would feel good about recommending. And then a book that I ran across early in my own experience is titled Kundalini Rising, Exploring the Energy of Awakening. And I would highly recommend it. It's a collection of essays that really describe a large variety of what can occur, and also to again help normalize the process. And just coming to know that you're not crazy and you're not alone can be extremely helpful, especially if it's jarring in the beginning. Any other particular resources that you, aside from your own work, of course?
Well, yeah, I mean, I quite like, well, for me, I would look, a lot of my research would be quite academic-y, maybe a bit dry for everyone. But yeah, I really look, if you are interested in looking at more academic papers, then academia.com, where you can just type in the keyword Kundalini, and there's a whole plethora of essays and research papers that come up on this topic. Yeah, so I'm fascinated with ancient Indian texts. So I look at a lot of the historical or scriptural aspects of this manifestation. The first book that brought me onto this was by a guy called Lisa Nella. This is a very old book, but there's another lady called Lillian Silburn. She wrote a wonderful book on Kundalini. For me, I'm particularly fascinated with the tradition, the early Buddhist tradition. So looking at people who have really mastered this energy and their hints, their advice, their directions. And this would be monks like Sayadaw, U Pandita, Mahasi Sayadaw. These are living masters who have really nailed the meditation of the Buddha and describe and guide the experiences and where we can take it to its really full potential, so for me, those people in the early Buddhist tradition, of course there are a few incredible people in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as well, but yeah, I like the pragmatic approach, with the clear instructions of meditation technique and how to get that. That's, for me, that works. That's great, but it depends on where you are drawn. In terms of books, let's see. There's Dr. Yvonne Kaysen, Bruce Scotton, Bruce Grayson, like you said. Itzhak Bentov has a really extraordinary take on it all. Stalking the Wild Pendulum. He wrote a book. This is quite an old book. Yeah, God, there's so much literature now, isn't there, on the topic?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's great that you brought in, just there's so many avenues that you can explore. And I guess related to that, something else that I've learned along the way is in some respects, if you've seen one Kundalini awakening, you've seen one Kundalini awakening. And so it can also be tempting to try to, you want to, or some of us, myself, getting an understanding of what's happening is helpful, reassuring, but can slip into another form of glamour where you're trying to check boxes and say, oh, well, I attended these things, so I had more of an awakening kind of thing. And so there isn't necessarily something like that. It isn't quite so quantitative.
No, right.
So being able to approach the information, if you are given to want to study academic literature, it's there. If you're given to wanting to study historical scripture, that can be a resource. If you're into social media, there are all sorts of places to find community through social media. There are lifetimes worth of podcasts and videos now that you can find. Lisa Nella, as you mentioned, he has a wonderful podcast on Kundalini that I had a couple of years ago when I was doing my initial exploration. So there's scads of resources, which again, I think can help normalize, can help help ground you in a way that says, okay, I'm not nuts and I'm not alone. And so
that's so true. No, you've hit the nail on the head, and I think that's so important. That we in our society there's stigma around things like psychosis, around things like about not being normal. I suppose that's changing gradually, but there is a fear when these experiences start to arise, and just to kind of have some background, like you said. Just to know, oh, this happens. This is a thing. This is a natural phenomena that can arise in the human, makes you just kind of go, oh, okay, I don't have to worry too much. I'm not completely losing my mind, and like you said, I think it's lovely that you mentioned this is a process as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to last forever. In terms of standing from the human perspective, it is a process in that it's a good thing that's happening. It's a purification. It's an opportunity to be used, with wisdom, with compassion, with loving kindness. That's something that we can, use to the advantage of humanity.
It's I just hope people can ingest this fully enough, because parts of the ride can blow you away, and it can be stimulating in many ways, and sometimes those ways can be very off-putting, because it is kind of like the movie The Matrix, where your understanding of reality gets just completely blown away, and then before the new understanding takes more form and settles in, you're in that period of kind of unknowing, and it can be very concerning. And so back to just go with it, know you're not alone kind of thing. And golly, there are so many things I heard you talking about, and now I'm tempted to say maybe we also need to do a part 2, because there are aspects of this that do get more esoteric in many ways, and they can also intersect with astronomical and astrological phenomena. You talked about something that just really set off bells and light bulbs for me in terms of aspects that relate to solar and lunar energy relationship. How there really can be something to, especially if you're having this type of experience, where lunar cycles can actually trigger aspects of the subtle anatomy, which can then intersect with our physical anatomy and physiology. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I suppose I'm wondering who is the audience here. There's a whole range of esoteric phenomena that is written extensively on this topic, and so there is, if I suppose for the general audience who's just being introduced to Kundalini and what it is, there's a whole depth to it which can get quite far out. But I'll caveat that with there's quite a lot of new research, neuroscience, and potential evidence that correlates in our biology that verifies a lot of what you were just talking about. So yeah, there is so my interest in this would be in the yogic literature, the ancient tantric and yogic literature, and this would be based on conversations throughout thousands of years, and it would be a conversation, it would be scriptures describing the experience, and it would be advanced meditators disclosing their own experience, and it would be instruction manuals and commentaries on the scriptures. So this is where all of this information would come from, as well with current research looking at individuals who are having these experiences and verifying them in reference to text. So, okay, so the whole lunar solar thing, there is, I'm wondering how much detail I should go into regarding the framework of this. How much time you got?
Well, I'm willing to go. Usually I try to, just be very deferential to our guests' time constraints. And if you want to go on, I'm happy to just let this expand. I do know your discussions elsewhere about Bindu and just, that beautiful energy kind of coming down was really pretty awesome. So, but at least introduce the topic again.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything wrong with us coming back, and then I do want to also give you time to, if there's any other resources that, or how people can reach you again, maybe we can highlight that as well.
Sure. Okay, so I have my notes here. So if we're to look at the body, the human body, it exists on multiple dimensions, on multiple layers of subtlety, starting from the physical, the flesh. It's dense. Energy is restricted by its flow through certain manifest pathways of flesh and bone and blood and everything that is our physical body. According to the Indian traditions, we have more subtle layers to our being, and this would be an energetic body, and within that, there are certain pathways or movements of energy that flow along certain areas, invigorating, energizing, and bringing to life the physical form. And this subtlety is layers and layers of integrated density, if you like, from the most gross to the most subtle being pure consciousness, and integrated layers throughout. Now, in the Indian traditions, we are said to be the first manifest thing would be Bindu. Bindu would be a kind of life force or mind. As the human forms, as the flesh and blood comes into manifestation through a differentiated process of the universe unfolding in a particular way, which Sankhya philosophy goes into in detail, what we have is a Bindu in its purest form that exists in all of us in the cranial vault. This is very much connected to seminal fluid or the mind. So a yogi or a practitioner or a monk or whoever would learn to still the mind, and by stilling the mind, they are stilling the Bindu. Now, normally, when we go about our day-to-day activities, this Bindu is moving through. There are two major channels, the Ida and Pingala, the two major energy channels, and Sushumna through the middle. Maybe some of you into yoga may have heard of this. Normally, the Bindu flows through the left channel, the lunar channel, and that is giving life to our system. You could describe this as maybe norepinephrine, or the part of our parasympathetic nervous system that animates us to make us act and interact with the world around us, stimulates our sense organs so that we can engage with the physical realm. Now, when you meditate, when you still the mind, that the Ida, the Bindu, stops. And the more we learn to withdraw the senses in, that Bindu goes into the central channel. We're also governed by solar energy. And this solar energy is heated and stimulated through the Manipura chakra. This is like our umbilical cord to our physical, our physicality within our solar system. So it's where we get our solar energy from, which also ignites the being. The reason we have life on this planet is because of the sun. So,
and could you just, for those who might not be familiar, the Manipur chakra, we put numbers to them sometimes, or colors. So where would that fit in the usual 7 chakra map?
So it would be the chakras are like energy centers within the subtle body, which animate certain aspects of our being, bring into our consciousness certain dimensions of consciousness. So the Manipura chakra would be around the belly button. It would be in the usual. There's loads and loads of chakras, but in the usual framework, there's about 7. There's loads more, but the general yogic description would be about 7: the base chakra, the root chakra, the svadhisthana chakra, that was sometimes referred to as the sexual chakra, the belly button, that's the Manipura. So that would be where we get our life force, our solar energy. Normally the solar energy eats up our day-to-day life force, our bindu, and that's where the aging process, and that's why we die. So we live our life using up this bindu, and the solar energy is burning that up. When you draw everything into the central channel, the solar fire goes into the central channel as well. So this is through stilling the mind, through meditation practices which still the mind. In different traditions, they say different things happen. So the solar energy, once it's brought into the central channel, so the movement of these energies go into different channels depending on the state of consciousness of the individual. When through concentration techniques, the bindu is brought into central channel, the solar energy no longer has anything to consume, so it is also brought into the central channel and ignites bindu in the central channel. And that's where you get a state of ecstasy and bliss that flow through the system, this opening of Kundalini, the classic experience which arises. There is a mechanism, there's a detailed mechanism that happens within the brain, and this is through the Vishuddhi chakra. So we could, I'm not sure, there's a lot of research that goes into this in terms of the neurobiology, the neurochemistry as well. And they're just maps that potentially lay on. I'm not saying they are, this is how it is, but a lot more work has to go into this to really verify it. But there's uncanny similarities in terms of what the subtle body maps say the functions are and what the physiology does. So the Vishuddhi chakra would, in the Indian traditions, control the movement of Amrita. Amrita is bindu. That's another word for it. Amrita is a kind of elixir of life almost. When the individual, through speech, action, intention, is purified, so is the Vishuddhi chakra purified, and it moves bindu into a particular channel at the back of the throat. And then that can then move into Sahasrara, which is there's a nadi. Nadi is a channel called Brahma Nadi. It moves this bindu into Brahma Nadi, and that's where you get the full-blown Kundalini. That's with a very purified individual. This is governed by the phases of the moon. There are 16 petals. They're drawn as petals, but the Theosophists actually talk about those 16 segments as wavelengths. In the tradition, these are referred to as phases of the moon, referred to or comparative to phases of the moon. So bindu builds up on the dark moon. All right, let me get this right. Does it build up in the full moon? When it builds up in the full moon and it's emptied in the dark moon. So the 16 petals refer to the 16 phases of the moon. So we go through cycles of being energized, full of bindu, and then drained. So on a monthly basis, this happens. This is, I suppose, on a physiological level, the thyroid controls the neurochemistry of the pineal gland, the master gland, Ajna chakra, which in the yogic systems governs this whole system. So our circadian rhythms affect this cycle. So the sun and the moon have a really big influence on our energy levels. So the yogis were able to work out, and again with the equinoxes as well, depending on the positioning of the sun and the moon, in terms of how much solar energy we're able to use or gather, as well as the monthly lunar cycles. So when it is said that at the equinoxes there is a balance of Ida and Pingala, it's easier to bring the mind into the central channel, to bring the mind still at the equinoxes. So they're considered a very important time of the year for yogis to practice. It's often a time where people have Kundalini experiences as well, the equinoxes. So, they happen spontaneously as well. So yeah, there's a real subtle mechanism at play here with these functions, I suppose, that enable, on one level, the neurochemistry to move to a certain place, and on another level, these subtle fluids, subtle energies to move into a certain place. So it's kind of like a mechanism. We're like a sort of mechanism. Once it's all in alignment, then it all goes off.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, it's neat. Then there's oh boy, you just scratched the surface in terms of what all can be done. I'm gonna try to wind this up.
Yeah, go on forever about this, couldn't we? Yeah.
Question, and I, again, just for our audiences, you wrote in an email to me that you have no greater joy than talking about these things, and it just, to me, it just captured what I've been trying to articulate for years. There's something about being able to learn about this, all of consciousness and spirituality in its various forms, but certainly these things we've been talking about today, that just has its own special joy. So it's like to find those other people at this,
oh gosh,
that are here with us at
Yeah.
the same time and can have these conversations. In one of your other presentations or interviews, I believe in the context of your personal mission with regard to your work and as it is related to Kundalini, I believe you said something like you feel that this is the or at least a source that humanity's evolution, it's a vehicle for that.
Yeah.
And that is one of the main areas of focus for our IFGT organization, is to try and do what we can to facilitate that evolution, so that the synchronicity of this information with that part of our mission is relevant. And I think I didn't want to leave that out of this conversation, just because while it may not happen in our lifetimes, we are still evolving as a species, even though sometimes we, I think, like to think that we're the most advanced we've ever been and ever will be. But obviously that's not the case. We'll continue to evolve. And so there can also be a collective aspect to this, not just the individual experience, but it seems there are more instances of this. It just kind of feels like it. And I don't know if it's documented anywhere. Any last thoughts on Kundalini's role in humanity's evolution?
Oh, okay. Yes. So this is just my personal opinion with Kundalini. I believe that it is it has as an energy, as a consciousness, it has a desire to meet its maker. And if you're the vehicle through which it's moving through, then you will go along for that ride as well. In terms of, I don't want to get religious with this, because that's not not where I'm at with it, but in terms of the origins of consciousness, that's what I'm talking about. The understanding the nature of consciousness, insight into the nature of consciousness. I think in terms of where human evolution, my dream, my hope, my wish, my aspiration and work is towards, like yourself, opening up a gateway towards that being our prerogative, is understanding the nature of consciousness and the universe. And as a result, what seems to happen when people do this is a developed sensitivity. As a result of this sensitivity, a betterment in society is created. You don't have a choice. You have to care about people around you because you feel them more. And that's painful and beautiful and messy and wonderful. But as we progress, we will become more compassionate to the people around us. We've stopped sending children up chimneys, which is a great thing. We're slowly evolving as a result of compassion. And that was an interesting thing, when anthropologists discovered human bones, they said, a sure sign of human evolution wasn't development of technologies. It was the fact that they could see broken bones had healed, which meant the community had stayed to wait for that person to heal before they moved on.
Nice.
And that was how humanity developed. That was how our society began to develop. We started to care for people in our community.
Well, and I at least I sense that when humanity has evolved in the course of the evolution, that will feel difficult maybe, and the change to it will probably not happen overnight. But assuming that it is more of a gradual evolution, at some point it will be natural. It'll be part of our nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's it. The trailblazers kind of have to suffer sometimes. Right. And that's the case in all situations. The first people to experience and come out, they're going to get, chastised for it. They're going to get told they're wrong or mad. And I think that's always the way in every area of development. And soon, I hope, it will become necessary. And I think, when AI starts to become more prominent in our society, as it is becoming now, the question of sentience and consciousness will become more of a theme, as it is. I mean, I'm reading in the New Scientist, consciousness exploration of AI. What is it to be sentient? What is it to be human? What is it to exist, and why, all of that stuff is becoming more mainstream as a hot topic, I think. And
2 hours easily.
Yeah, totally. yeah.
No, that's well, this has been a delight. I certainly hope to stay in touch.
Oh, likewise. It's been lovely talking to you.
Besides your website, any other resources that you have that you would like to share with people so they know how to reach you?
On my website, there's a page of resources which I've found really enjoyable, sort of podcasts, various experts in this field, I suppose, some really interesting characters, some amazing interviews. So on my website, there's a page called Resources, and in that will be academic and different podcasts researching or looking into or interviewing characters in this area. So that's I'm still gathering and trying to share things which I really enjoy. I quite like the academic research because I feel that the methodology in finding and resourcing information is quite thorough, and I like that depth. I love that rigor that goes into finding information in a deep and resourceful way. So, and of course, as on the flip side, I'm really fascinated by adept practitioners and what they can teach. so, and that's totally not academic and just experience based and practice. So yeah, I like to combine those two things. But that resource page is a good one. Academia as well. I have some papers that I've written on the topic, but they're maybe quite dry. It's very academic.
But again, Ann, it's wonderful for those that are still with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. We had a really engaged audience and a beautiful topic. Just a real treat and pleasure. And
thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for listening as well. It's yeah. If anyone has any questions, please get in touch. Okay,
great. Thanks again for joining us in Transformations Cafe. Have a wonderful evening.